He thought he was just another washed-up has-been in first class, until he found out who he really was. The first-class cabin smelled of leather and aged whiskey. Soft conversations hummed in the background, accompanied by the occasional clink of a tumbler against a tray. Overhead, bins clicked shut as passengers settled in, adjusting sleek carry-ons and polished boots. Nathan Kessler barely glanced up from his phone as he dropped into seat 3A, a window seat, exactly how he liked it. He exuded the kind of confidence that came from years of closing deals and sitting in boardrooms where people laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. He ordered a scotch before takeoff, loosening his tie as if to silently declare to everyone that he was the kind of man who belonged in first class. The flight from Dallas to Los Angeles was just under 3 hours. Not long, but long enough for him to savor the perks of luxury travel. He had no intention of working, not when there were top-shelf drinks and the chance to scope out the cabin. That's when he noticed him, a weathered man seated a few rows ahead, his profile etched with lines as he leafed through a dog-eared script. There was something about him, something familiar, but not enough to pin down. Maybe he was a retired stuntman, a B-movie relic, someone who'd had his shot and was riding out the residuals. Nathan smirked, nudging the man in the seat next to him, a quiet traveler who had the misfortune of sitting beside someone who loved the sound of his own voice. Ever notice how some people think a little fame buys them a permanent pass? Nathan mused, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man beside him gave a polite, non-committal grunt, keeping his eyes on the in-flight magazine. He wasn't interested in conversation, but Nathan didn't need an audience to keep talking. He looks familiar, he went on, tilting his head. Probably some old TV cowboy who's been milking the same role for decades. You know the type. Leather jacket, squinting at nothing, still acting like he's on set. His words drifted into the space around him, catching the ears of those nearby. A few glanced his way, but the man stayed focused on his script, either oblivious or indifferent to Nathan's commentary. That didn't sit well with him. Guys like that were supposed to care what men like him thought. The plane began taxiing, and the flight attendant made her final rounds, checking seat belts and collecting empty glasses. Nathan leaned back, stretching slightly, already bored with the flight before it had even begun. He watched as the weathered man handed off his drink with a curt nod to the attendant, his posture solid, his demeanor unshaken. It grated on him. There was a quiet grit about him, a steadiness that suggested he wasn't the type to flinch at cheap shots or sly looks, and that made Nathan double down. He shifted, making sure his voice carried just enough. Must have made a fortune back in the day, he mused, shaking his head as if he found the whole thing amusing. That's usually how it goes. Old action money, living off reruns, probably got a prop gun stashed somewhere. It's always the same. This time there was a subtle shift in the air. The businessman across the aisle flicked a glance at him, brief but sharp. The flight attendant paused for a heartbeat as she moved past. Even the man next to him let out a faint sigh, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Nathan, of course, didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He reached for his scotch as the plane lifted off, tapping his fingers against the glass. 3 hours, plenty of time to entertain himself. But what he didn't realize was that his entertainment was about to cost him. The plane had barely leveled off when Nathan picked up his commentary. He wasn't the kind of man who let things slide, especially not when he felt snubbed. The man, whoever he was, hadn't looked up, hadn't given the slightest hint he'd heard or cared. That rankled Nathan, so he leaned in. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, he flagged down the flight attendant with a theatrical wave, as if he were hailing a cab rather than sitting in first class. "Another scotch," he said, handing over his empty glass. Then, just to stir the pot, he nodded toward the weathered man. "And whatever he's having too, on me." It was a jab, a way to get a rise. Maybe he'd grunt, tip his head, toss out a line about the good old days. Guys like him thrive on nostalgia. At least that's what Nathan figured. But the flight attendant didn't flinch. "He's good, sir," she said evenly, taking his glass and gliding away before he could push it. Nathan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. So he was one of those, the kind of guy who acted too tough for small gestures, who played like he didn't need the attention. He turned back to his reluctant seatmate, who had cracked open a novel in a blatant bid to tune him out. "You ever notice that?" Nathan said, wrapping the armrest between them. "How some people swagger around like they're still calling the shots, like the rest of us are just extras in their dusty old Western?" The man gave him a quick look before burying his nose back in his book. "Not really." Nathan grinned. He wasn't dropping this. "I'll tell you exactly who he is," he continued, keeping his voice at that sweet spot. Not too loud to get called out, but loud enough for the cabin to catch it. "He's the kind of guy who's been coasting on one big break, some director's washed-up pal maybe, or an actor who peaked with bell-bottoms and bad lighting." He let the words hang, waiting for a twitch, a reaction, anything to show he'd hit a nerve. Nothing. The weathered man kept turning pages, steady as a rock, like Nathan wasn't even a blip on his radar. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose, fiddling with his watch in annoyance. This wasn't fun anymore. Not even a flicker. He muttered, "Guess he's too grand for the likes of us." A few rows back, a woman in a sleek blazer swapped a knowing glance with her seatmate. Across the aisle, an older guy peeked over his newspaper, one eyebrow cocked. People were clocking him now, but Nathan, in his smug bubble, assumed they were in on it, that they saw this guy as a joke too. And that's why he pushed harder. He leaned forward, propping his elbow on the armrest, dropping his voice just enough to sound like he was letting them in on something. "Mark my word," he said, smirking. "He's going to spin some yarn later, probably about roping steers or slugging a bad guy. Guys like him love playing the grizzled vet. But I guarantee you—" "Pardon me, fella." The voice was low, gravelly, unmistakable. Nathan turned his head, expecting the flight attendant. Instead, he locked eyes with the weathered man himself. For the first time, he'd turned fully toward him, his face etched and unreadable. No anger, no annoyance, just a look, a hard, steady squint that made Nathan suddenly aware of how his voice had been bouncing around the cabin. For the first time in a long time, he felt a jolt of unease, a rare crack in his armor, but he brushed it off. He held the gaze, waiting for a barb, a comeback, something to spar with, but nothing came. The man just gave him a long, quiet once-over, then a faint, tight-lipped nod before turning back to his script, dismissing him like a pesky fly. And for the first time, Nathan felt something unfamiliar. Nathan shifted in his seat, tugging at his cufflink as if it could steady the discomfort seeping into his chest. That look, it wasn't smug, it wasn't riled. It was worse. It was weathered, like he'd stared down 1,000 punks and pegged Nathan as a lightweight without breaking a sweat. That should have made it easy to shrug off, to scoff and sip his scotch, but it didn't. Instead, it stuck with him. The flight attendant returned with his drink, setting it down with a brisk nod before moving on. He noticed she didn't linger. No chit-chat, no courtesy smile. Had she caught his act too? He took a slow sip, the ice clinking against the glass, then shot a glance at the man again. Clint, he reminded himself. He still didn't have a firm fix on him, but that squint nagged at his memory. He was still reading, still unbothered, but now that he'd clocked Nathan once, there was a silent line between them. A dare laid bare. Nathan didn't back down from dares, so he tossed out, this time straight at him, keeping his voice low but loud enough for the cabin to catch the edges. "Clint, huh? Doesn't fit you." No response. A twinge tightened his gut, but he pressed on. "I mean, no offense," he added. "It's just, I don't know. You look more like a Buck or a Hank. Clint's too tame for a guy like you." He chuckled, shaking his head. Still nothing. Nathan shifted again. This wasn't just being ignored now. It was being left to flop. Across the aisle, the older guy had returned to his paper, but Nathan had caught his earlier glance. Judging. 2 rows up, a younger suit was pretending to peck at his laptop, but Nathan knew the drill. He was all ears. Even the flight attendant, gliding by with a tray, kept him in her peripheral. The realization hit. Nobody was chuckling with him. He huffed through his nose, slumping back. Fine, let them be stiff. People these days took everything so seriously, like a little ribbing was a capital crime. He hadn't said anything that bad. He downed the last of his scotch, the glass hitting the tray with a thud. And then, as if the timing was scripted, the flight attendant spoke. "Mr. Eastwood, need another drink?" Nathan barely registered it at first. It wasn't until the man, Clint, looked up with a gravelly, "Nope, I'm set," that it clicked. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. His whole frame locked up, fingers gripping the armrest. It all fell into place. Hollywood titan, director, actor, the man who'd turned squints into cinema gold, a living legend who, oh God, wasn't just familiar from late-night reruns. He was the guy who'd defined grit for half a century. Nathan's throat turned to sandpaper. He flicked his eyes toward him, but Clint wasn't looking. He didn't need to. He'd already sized him up, and now Nathan got it too. For the first time on this flight, Nathan was speechless. Nathan swallowed hard, his mind spinning like a busted reel, hunting for a way out. Clint Eastwood, the name thudded in his skull, each beat stripping his swagger bare. His grip tightened on the armrest. How had he missed it? He'd seen him in grainy black and white shootouts, color-drenched crime sagas, behind-the-scenes clips that ran on cable for decades. He'd faced down gunslingers, directed masterpieces, and shrugged off time like it was a bad take. And now, he was a few seats away, realizing every snide, half-mumbled jab Nathan had lobbed had landed square on the wrong target. His face went pale. He scanned the cabin, suddenly alive to how many ears had been in range. The older guy with the paper, the suit on his laptop, the flight attendant who'd caught it all. Had he just taken pot shots at Clint Eastwood in front of a packed first-class crowd? Nathan cleared his throat, squirming in his seat. He had to patch this up. He angled toward him, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack. I thought you looked familiar," he said, coaxing out a shaky laugh. "Didn't peg I was flying with a Hollywood king." Clint didn't budge. He didn't turn, didn't grunt, just kept flipping pages like Nathan was dust on the wind. Nathan's gut twisted. He'd heard every word, clocked every dig, and decided Nathan wasn't worth a blink. That stung more than a dressing down. Way more. A comeback would have given Nathan something to swing at, a chance to laugh it off. But this was a slow burn. Clint had let him hang himself with his own rope. Nathan fiddled with his seatbelt, scrambling for a lifeline, anything to claw back some ground. "I grew up on your films," he tried, keeping it light. "You're the real deal." Nothing. No flicker, no nod. Nathan's skin crawled. He exhaled, scrubbing his jaw. The flight's remaining hours stretching out like a bad shoot. A quick embarrassment was one thing. Being caged at altitude with his own mess was another. And just when he thought it couldn't sink lower, the flight attendant swung by. "Another drink, sir?" she asked. Nathan opened his mouth, then faltered. Something about more booze felt off now. "Just water," he grumbled. She nodded, snagging his empty glass, and that's when he caught it, a faint, weathered twitch at Clint Eastwood's lip. He hadn't turned, hadn't spoken, but Nathan knew. He'd been watching, biding his time, and now he was relishing the squirm. For the first time in years, Nathan Kessler knew what small felt like. Nathan sat stiff as a board, his own words piling on him like a collapsed set. How had he botched this? He prided himself on reading the room, steering the talk, never ending up the chump. But here he was, boxed in by his own bluster, staring at the back of a head that had undone him without a move. His brain clawed for a fix. Apologize, crack a joke, play it dead. He darted looks at the others, sizing up the fallout. The suit across the aisle wasn't watching anymore, but that smirk said he'd seen plenty. The flight attendant kept it pro, dropping his water with a blank glance. Nathan cleared his throat. "Thanks." She nodded and moved off, and that hit worse. She didn't care. He didn't register. He flicked his eyes to Clint, still buried in his script, still cool as steel, and that's what cut deepest. He wasn't mad, wasn't waiting for groveling. He'd written Nathan off as a nobody. Nathan loathed that, and he'd brought it on himself. His fingers drummed the tray, antsy, raw. He flashed on the Eastwood he knew, the steely glares, the slow drawls, the guy who'd turned grit into gold. And he, like a fool, had thought he'd bite at his bait. Nathan exhaled slow, maybe the altitude, maybe the dead end. But for the first time in ages, he wondered what he'd turned into. He'd spent years strutting into rooms like he owned them, talking like his take trumped all, figuring his reality was the only one that counted. But here, he wasn't the heavy hitter, he wasn't calling shots, and it rattled him. The plane purred around him, the cabin eased into murmurs and clinking ice. Nathan grabbed his water, sipped, stared at the seat ahead. Maybe this was a lesson guys like him dodged till they couldn't. Maybe this was his tab coming due. Nathan peered out the window, the sky sprawling endless past the wing. Its scale shrank him down, tiny, irrelevant, a feeling he didn't know how to sit with. For years, he'd acted like the world spun around him. Folks laughed at his duds even when they flopped, nodded when he rambled even with nothing worth hearing. He'd owned the spotlight, but today he'd been schooled on something he'd buried. Respect wasn't cash, wasn't clout, wasn't the loudest yap, it was backbone. Clint Eastwood hadn't lifted a finger to cut him down. He'd let Nathan's own hot air do the trick. Nathan sipped his water, the chill hitting his throat. Not scotch, but maybe better for it. For once he needed to stew in his head without blurring it out. He glanced at Clint again, half hoping for a turn, a flicker of victory. But nada. He was through with him, had been since he sized him up as another suit with a big mouth. That truth knifed his chest. It wasn't often a guy like him had to stare down his own reflection, had to wallow in knowing he'd been the clown up there. Nathan sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe it was time to pipe down and tune in. Maybe it was time to think before he figured he had it all nailed. The flight attendant rolled by again, and for once Nathan didn't flag her for a refill. He just sat, eyeing the sky as the plane dipped toward LA. He got it now. This wasn't about Clint Eastwood. It was about the man he wanted to be moving forward. How often do we size folks up before we know their story? How many times has cockiness blocked the real picture? Maybe the takeaway here isn't fame or swagger. Maybe it's about giving respect before it bites back. If this hits you, tap that subscribe button. Who knows, next time you might dodge the same trap.